Okay, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Charles Spence, a world-famous experimental psychologist with a specialization in neuroscience-inspired multisensory design. In 1997, he established the Cross-Modal Research Lab at the Department of Experimental Psychology at Oxford University. And he has since worked with many of the world's largest companies across the globe. Much of his work focuses on the design of enhanced multisensory food and drink experiences, leading him to collaborate with chefs, baristas, mixologists, chocolatiers, etc., and the food and beverage and flavor and fragrance industries. Another question he's worked on extensively is how technology will transform our dining and drinking experiences in the future. Today, Charles will talk to us on how proprioceptive pleasures can enrich our aesthetic experiences. Charles, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. And to share with you some of the multisensory perspective. I come as an experimental psychologist, not as a philosopher or a practicing artist. And also with sort of a personal interest. Here we go. There we go. With a sort of personal interest in proprioceptive pleasures. My background is in multisensory perceptions, how all the senses integrate one with another to affect our experience and our memories, very much in the world of food and drink, but also increasingly in the world of entertainment as well. And that's kind of the theme for today. Thinking back a bit about proprioceptive pleasures and this sort of transition from proprioceptive entertainments, kinesthetic thrills, that have been a signature feature of the fairground and pleasure park for a century or more now, and how and what changes when they transition into the gallery space. And I guess we've had already, so I don't need to say much more on the sort of distinction between the various bodily senses, proprioception, kinesthesis. I might add to the list, it wasn't mentioned last time, the sort of the feeling of our body in motion, as well as the vestibular senses. And probably in any experience that engages some or all of those, proprioception, where our body is, kinesthesis, our feeling of it moving, and vestibular, the position of our body in space, it will also likely involve somatosensation too, the feeling of the skin being pressured or pushed as we feel ourselves flung out and around and about. So really maybe 4 bodily senses there before we get to any of those interoceptive ones that were mentioned earlier. But beyond those bodily senses, I think there's a sort of sense that these senses interact. So when thinking about proprioception, it is sort of fundamentally a multisensory experience. On one level, just probably integrating kinesthesis, vestibular, and quite likely also somatosensory input. But very often, and practically speaking, it will also engage and be influenced by the other senses, such as sight, which might lead, as in the op art, to us perhaps feeling sick, as was mentioned. And that was indeed, I think, the response of some of those who used to travel on this illusion, the haunted swing illusion, patented, I think, about 1890 something, and written about in the psychology journals in 1904 from the California State Fair. People enter the room, they sit on this sort of swing, and that sort of starts to swing back and forth, so stimulating, I guess, vestibular, perhaps kinesthetic senses, somatosensation too. And then at some point, the room itself starts to spin, so you're only swinging back and forth, and you have the illusion that you're swinging 360 degrees, when in fact you are not. So this is a proprioceptive bodily entertainment, we might call it. If we put it in an art gallery, I suppose we have to call it prop art, though I'm not sure anyone has put this particular illusion there as yet. But the key point that this, our senses do not exist in isolation. They are always our perception the result of multisensory integration, be that just within the bodily senses, but more often the integration of the bodily senses with the external or the distal senses of hearing, vision, and perhaps even smell, who knows, as well. And I'll come back to some quotes on that later on as people try and describe their experience of proprioceptive pleasures in the context of the theme park. And these slides have been mentioned already by Marcus, Carsten Höller's, which were exhibited in a number of venues now, I think 11 or 13 different galleries, museum spaces, including the Tate Modern in 2006. And as part of the experience at the new... Are you changing this? Or? As part of experience at the new Museum of Contemporary Art in New York in 2011, a collection of Höller's various proprioceptive and experiential works over the years, which created a lot of press interest, some of which I'll come back to a little later. And because this does, in Marcus's term, I guess, either directly stimulate proprioception and kinesthesis through you being in the slide, sliding through and down, or I guess Höller also talks about just you seeing other people. That's part of the reason for them to be transparent, that the viewers on the bottom of the turbine hall can see those who are having their bodies transformed through motion. And I want to think about this and they say, is it necessarily art, proprioceptive or otherwise? And what does it have to do to really to go beyond this same phenomenon or experience outside the context of the art gallery? And a number of Carsten Höller's works either just represent traditional fairground rides in the context of an art gallery, and or represent psychological illusions that we study in the laboratory, put them in an art gallery, and call it art. And it feels like one might need to do more for that, both because I could come as an experimental psychologist studying some of these illusions in the laboratory, and never thought of them as art, proprioceptive or otherwise. And also because what we see here, the helter skelter, perhaps the inspiration for Carsten Höller's slides, this kind of what is it meaning? What does helter skelter mean? Adverb meaning in confused, disorderly haste. And one of these helter skelters used to sit on our mantelpiece at home, because my parents grew up on the fairground and would sort of do rides such as this. So there's sort of family interest as well as a professional interest in taking these proprioceptive and kinesthetic entertainments and illusions from the lab and the fairground into the gallery. As far as I can tell, the first person to think about propelling people in this sort of chaotic, disorderly haste through helter skelters is about 1903 over in Coney Island in New York. And the earliest date I can get in the UK to about 1905, 1906, so quite a long history. The same thing's probably also true for one of Carsten Höller's other proprioceptive art works, experiential artworks, the Mirror Carousel from 2005, that was also shown at the Experience exhibit in New York in 2011. This, another kind of classic fairground ride that goes back even further to about 1860s and before, and again has just been repositioned into an art gallery, and so perhaps becomes proprioceptive art in so doing. Both for those who are encouraged to sit on the very slow-moving carousel, but also in his interviews, Höller suggests it's just those who are viewing others whose bodies are in movement. That is part of the experience, so indirect proprioception, perhaps one might call it. But it means wondering, is that all that we need to make these fairground rides into art, simply where they are displayed, or the intention of the artist placing them there? And we have had already, I guess, the institutional view, But if it's in an art gallery, well, that's good enough for many to call it art. And these exhibits are in a number of art galleries and spaces, and hence they do fulfill some of the criteria. But such as the Tate Modern and in New York. But probably that they stimulate proprioception, and that occurs in the context of an art gallery is not sufficient. And that was brought home to me just from this exhibit I saw 2 weeks ago now in New York, Trust with Fuse, sort of information technology. You're in a cube with projections on the wall, the ceiling, and on the floor, with some sort of ambient music in the background, and you'll sit there for half an hour as the artists collective involved tries to translate the notions of data and security into visuals and sound effects and such like. And as part of that, with this sort of quite immersive space, at some points the kind of the ground or horizon that's projected on the wall sort of tilts. And I was just sort of sitting and standing there going, suddenly I had a lot of proprioceptive awareness. Is the room really moving, or is it just what's on the walls? But this, I think, is an example. It is sort of proprioceptive. So it did stimulate my proprioceptive senses, self-awareness of body and its position in space. But I don't think it was deliberate or intentional. That was an incidental consequence of the exhibit, and not necessary to, I think, enjoy it, or perhaps even not even thought about by the collective who put this together. So that wouldn't count as proprioceptive art, even though it was in the context of an art gallery, and it did stimulate my, and I presume others, proprioceptive senses. So then we might just put that together to, in a sense, concur with Marcus that proprioceptive art must have that proprioceptive, kinaesthetic, and/or vestibular component. It helps, certainly, if it is in the context of an art gallery or exhibition space. I think this proprioceptive element needs to be intentionally foregrounded in the viewer's experience. And I'll come back to this question of whether it's enough for the artist to intend to stimulate proprioception, or whether the receiver, me, or you, needs to be aware of that intention or experience the result. And I think maybe might be more important than was suggested, but we'll see. And then finally, as Marcus mentioned, and I think we'll hear more about later, there's the question of vicarious awareness of body through our experience of dance and performance is sort of something we've written a bit about, linking into the mirror neuron system, but not one I really want to pursue any further here. I focus primarily on that sort of first-person perspective of the viewer, sliding down the slide, rather than looking at others doing things. But we might ask, okay, so we have these works that, for argument's sake, are in the art gallery and that do intentionally stimulate proprioception and/or the other bodily senses that we lump together. But would we necessarily want to call it an aesthetic experience? In sort of Kant's notion of it being disinterested, might be another way to press our definitions, I think. And this is something I've used more often in the context of food, to say whether we can have can food be art? And sort of building on Kant's suggestion in his Critique of Judgment that aesthetic judgments are characterized by three key features: their subjectivity, their disinterested nature, and their claim of universality. Similarly, in their review of the scientific literature on visual aesthetics, Palmer and colleagues argue that aesthetic judgments are disinterested in the sense that they do not involve desire. Hence, in the context of food, preferring a large to a small piece of cake would not count as an aesthetic judgment, because you can't really make that judgment without reference to the self and your desire to eat the larger piece of cake. So in this case, gastroporn is not kind of an aesthetic. Food is not art, and can't be. And I also wonder whether the same thing could use the same argument about disinterested in the context of proprioceptive experience, proprioceptive artworks, to say there too, very often it might not be possible to take a disinterested stance if you are the one sliding down the slide on the other, a roller coaster. The characters here, certainly you wouldn't want to call them disinterested, being able to take an objective view of the experience that they are having on the roller coaster. And if one looks in the literature on theme park and fairground rides and the psychology therein, I think there are some insights perhaps for the way we think about proprioceptive arts. So here we have just one quote, but one element of the best theme park fairground rides is the total immersion that such rides so often elicit. Just take the following description of a ride experienced by Conniff. A sharp, wincing intake of breath, and the feeling of innards popping up like a parachute in one's rib cage. These are all proprioceptive, interoceptive stuff, very much foregrounded. My hair flew back and my eyes peeled wide and filled with tears, a product of the 60-mile-an-hour wind and also of self-pity. My teeth clenched and my knuckles locked bone-white around the lap bar. The train plunged into a short, hell-rattling tunnel, whipped around a sharp turn in the dark and roared up another hill. Scenery stuttered by like a film getting snagged in the gate of the projector. Everything veered out of control, and it was clear that I was about to die. Not disinterested evaluation of that proprioceptive experience or entertainment. And indeed, Höller himself notes that those who partake of one of his slide installations, that when they come down the slides, they have a sort of particular facial expression about them, and they're affected and they're to some degree changed by the experience. So perhaps hinting at this, it may be difficult to take the disinterested stance once our body is involved and it is thrown about in unpredictable ways. That said, if one takes a closer look at the mirror carousel, one of the things that's noted about it, irritates in fact some of the observers and some of the critics, is it's very slow.
No.
Speed. Like the slide transitions. That the carousel doesn't go at the normal speed it would go on a fairground, perhaps for health and safety reasons, because it is in an art gallery. We need to think more about potential accidents and so on. And they describe it as the maddening slowness of the carousel. It turns, yes, it is in movement, but it's so slow that maybe that does sort of allow you to take this sort of disinterested stance about it. It's predictable movement, and it's very, very slow movement, and hence that might lead into this sort of discussion of relational aesthetics, in which much of Höller's work is grouped. But maybe here we need to be a little careful, because if you read the quotes about Höller and his work and what he's intending to do, then it's all part of the story is about sort of foregrounding that sort of subjective personal experience and contrasting it with the exhibits and illusions that he takes from the science or the psychology or neuroscience lab, where he claims that subjective personal experience in science is a no-no. Whereas here in my installations, slow down as they may be, it's all about your relation to the artwork. It's all about the subjective personal experience that is foregrounded through the proprioceptive and or other senses. But that's kind of ironic in a way, I think, when you look at some of his exhibits, with that notion that subjective judgment in science is a no-no, and then he comes out with his upside-down goggles, again lifted from the psychology labs, 1895, 1897 thereabouts. Psychologists were using these to study how quickly we could flip visual perception, wearing pseudophones to switch the ears around and seeing how quickly you could flip your hearing of left and right, wandering around the streets of Berlin, nearly being run over by carriages that you heard over there but actually came from the other side. And if you go back to any of these early papers, all they report is subjective experience. It's what's it like for those who are wearing the inverting glasses, the pseudophones that switch the ears. There's no objective measurement. It's all about subjective. So this is kind of a curious choice of an illusion. If one takes the Pinocchio illusion, another one that where you vibrate that arm, and it feels like your nose is getting really long. This together with the rubber hand illusion, where I stroke a hand and it feels like your hand is a rubber hand. You have an out-of-body experience. He hasn't turned that into an artwork yet, but both of those rely in the scientific papers that study them on subjective report. How strongly did you feel that that rubber hand was your hand? How long did you feel that your nose was? Subjective is center stage, I admit. In some areas, we try to limit subjectivity, but it is key, and ironically key, to a number of the exhibits that Höller has. So we've seen, and was mentioned already, I just sort of was busily typing in some of the proprioceptive works that were mentioned by Marcus. Put them all together, it feels like there is a movement, a thought, or at least an increasing excitement around proprioceptive works of art in recent years from Höller, but then also from the various other artists here, and the one we will experience a little bit later on. So you might ask, well, what is it about now? Why has proprioceptive art, or maybe experiential art, become so popular in the contemporary era? And one might say it's something about growing interest in the body more generally as a subject of study and inquiry. Or maybe as a more cynical take, I wonder how much it's about the footfall and the experience that, there's been a huge increase in various kinds of experiential art, things like the Tate Sensorium from 2015 for paintings from the collection where you could see a view of Sir Francis Bacon's Hyde Park while eating a chocolate specially created to match the painting with its gritty smokiness while hearing a soundscape. Other works like John Latham's painting Full Stop to be experienced with a soundscape that sort of both echoed the size of the full stop and also the little dots at the side, while your hand was in a box feeling virtual or ultra haptics. You could feel your hand being touched without literally touching anything. And these kind of sensorium, sensplorations, immersive and experiential art, I think have grown in popularity precisely because more and more galleries are being judged and their funding so tightly linked to footfall that it's not sufficient anymore to provide a highbrow, sort of academically worthwhile exhibition, but you need to demonstrate boots on the ground. And for that, maybe it's just much easier to bring the punters in by presenting what you might call either entertainment, which is, isn't it, what you get when you take a fairground ride into an art gallery, or maybe edutainment. It's kind of mixing of educational and entertaining experience. And as the critics note, these experiential and proprioceptive art shows, things like Experience from Höller in 2011, are a great success with the public. Huge queues to get in. But they seem to fail with the critics, who aren't so sure that this push towards more people through the doors, greater audience numbers linked to increased funding, is really the way to go. So one nice article from Lynn talking about the critics' response to Höller's Experience 2011 in New York. Who notes that if we take the critics' evaluations as the guiding factor of whether or not Experience is a successful exhibition in a phenomenologically reflective sense, we can be sure it is not. Micah Pollock synthesizes the sentiment when she writes, if the traditional work of art addresses the viewer as a thinking, aesthetically critical being, much of relational aesthetics, including this show from Höller, addresses the spectator in a more familiar mode, that of the consumer. Experience from Höller turns the museum into a fun house, but at a cost. What we lose is the critical faculty, which in a way brings us full circle. Mr. Höller's is an exceptionally fun exhibition to visit and a particularly difficult one to review. I would argue for a second look after the effects of the exhibition, nausea, headaches, bruises, salty ears from the flotation tank, etc., have worn off. then maybe a focused reflection of the works is possible. The subjective individual experience is, in the end, up to the viewer, the rat in the laboratory, the scientist in the lab coat, or the visitor in the carnival, the connection back to the fairground or theme park. So maybe we should be a little sceptical of the growing popularity of prop art if its purpose is primarily in terms of footfall and entertaining, rather than allowing for this more reflective aesthetic judgments. One of my other main point to think about is really to say, does it make sense to think of proprioceptive art, or is all art, or at least proprioceptive art, really multisensory art? That it engages more senses. And here I think, as a multisensory scientist, I know that I and my colleagues around the world, we study hearing, we study vision, we study touch, I study smell and taste, and the bodily senses are kind of ignored. We know there are lots of them, and we know they must interact, but proprioception, vestibular, kinaesthetic is kind of at the sidelines of the multisensory research conferences. So bodily senses are ignored by multisensory scientists, and yet I think, proprioception and bodily sensation is fundamentally multisensory. We mentioned both integrating the bodily senses themselves, but also within the other more distal senses too. And maybe our response, our bodily experience in any situation, is a function of all of those senses put together. So it's not really uniquely proprioceptive. Maybe I'm just sort of stressing what you'd call sort of the indirect effects from the Bridget Riley in a way. But I want to say we need to think about proprioception, be it in an art gallery, be it in the fairground, be it in the science lab, as a multisensory phenomenon engaging several, if not all, of the senses, bodily and otherwise. And this, maybe could be reframed as stressing the sort of indirect effect, indirect proprioceptive art, as in staring at Bridget Riley, at your vision, that then is sort of inducing bodily sensations. Maybe I'm saying more that vision can modify bodily sensations rather than inducing them from nowhere. And we can take any sort of experience and say, it's even the simplest of our perceptual experiences are fundamentally multisensory. That we can't even get a sense of a dot of light, which might seem like a purely visual phenomenon, without being able to integrate a retinal signal with proprioceptive and bodily signals to get a sort of stable position. Do we know if the light's moving or not? It's only as a result of integrating the senses that we get that sense of space. And similarly, some of the other sensations that you mentioned from the quote from Armitage Armstrong from 1962 about these interoceptive bodily sensations. Should we think about thermo art? That might seem like a purely interoceptive sense, and yet they're just like wherever one looks, our perception of either the temperature of ourselves or the temperature of the environment in which we find ourselves is significantly affected by the colour of the lighting, by the sound. And there's lots of work from Germany about trying to manipulate thermal comfort of airline passengers by changing the light in the cabin. You can't turn hot into cold, but you can get a degree or two of extra warmth and shift the thermal comfort levels simply by changing what one sees. So in this sense, probably any other proprioceptive bodily or internal sense one could show is actually the result of integration from multiple senses, or at least can be cross-modally influenced by the other senses. And then one might even think, slightly jumping, but coming back to the question about the intentionality and the experience of the viewer in the proprioceptive element. How important is that? Is it enough that the author intended the bodily senses to be stimulated? Well, if we take another interoceptive signal like salivation, then one goes back to the 16th century, then there was a fashion, a trend amongst Dutch still life painters of fruits. They'd always have a sliced lemon on the table in the bowl of fruits. Why so? Well, the belief was the best artists could make their viewers salivate simply by seeing this cut lemon glistening, and that was why it was there. So in that sense, one would have to say Dutch still life painting is proprioceptive art, I guess. But until I went to an art conference and this was explained to me, I had no idea that I was supposed to salivate. I don't think I do salivate. An individual difference between people. Some, I imagine, do. So in this case, it just sort of doesn't feel right to include Dutch still life paintings as proprioceptive art, even though they fulfill lots of the criteria, unless you say, it's important that the viewer or observer has the desired effect or knows what the desired effect was supposed to be, whether or not they actually experience it, perhaps. And if we take more specifically in the context of proprioceptive thrills and kinesthetic pleasures, the fairground, the theme park rides that Höller and others integrate into the art context, then clearly for this illusion, the haunted swing illusion, it only works as a result of the integration of your bodily movement with the visual signals telling you that you're actually upside down. It wouldn't be half as much fun, half as engaging, immersive, without the room swinging around you to give you that full illusion of a 360-degree tilt. And while it might be obvious that vision is going to be part of the story here in terms of proprioception and kinesthesis and bodily sensation, I think there's also a role for sound. And that's both the sound of the rides, but the sounds of the people on the rides, the sounds that surround the rides, seems in first-person sort of descriptions of what going to a theme park or a fairground is like. It's a truly multisensory experience. And it's not just about the proprioceptive experience on the dodgems, on the helter, skelter, or whatever. It's about the total multisensory experience. Here we have one suggestion here. Imagine entering a theme park where no music is playing and the rides are not making their usual whooshing and clanging noises. Such an experience doesn't quite match up to our expectation of what the theme park should be. Sort of like watching an action movie on mute, or sitting in an empty restaurant where there is no din of fellow diners and no playing on the stereo. As the authors note, there is no more effective tool for shaping the mood in a space than sound. That sensations and sentiments are aroused by sound leads the authors to suggest that all themed spaces should include the power of sound, whether it be through a theme song, a special effect, or story-enhancing dialogue. Indeed, some of those fairground rides, like Scream Zone at Luna Park, are kind of referenced in terms of the noise you hear, not in terms of the proprioceptive sensations you get. It's about the screams you hear of the others that somehow amplify the excitement or anticipation or unease. And then if you speak to the engineers behind the theme park rides, then they write, there's a lot of psychology in the design of a good theme park. It's not just engineering, it's about human psychology of the senses. As Russell Nye notes, though engineers are quite capable of designing relatively noiseless cars, they know that the sound of the ride is an integral part of it, and that the rattles, squeaks, and thunderous roar of the wheels impart a sense of speed and danger that adds immeasurably to the total effect. So here, kinesthesis, feeling of our body in motion, is not just a result of kinesthetic senses and bodily stimulation, it's also the sounds that we hear. And that sometimes sounds aren't there because they're necessary. On the contrary, sounds are sometimes intentionally placed within the environment because of the cognitive associations that they will invoke. The rattle, the wind of the machine itself, the screams of the others having that experience. And I think this is something, this sort of multisensory nature is something I'm sort of pursuing at the moment as I look back over the history of proprioceptive pleasures, kinesthetic thrills in the fairgrounds. It's sort of striking how often those who created these rides knew the power of the multisensory. And if one takes one other early fairground ride, the steam yachts, patented in 1888, just two swinging, a bit like a haunted swing, two swings going back and forth in counterpoint, but always steam yachts had an organ in the middle between the two steam yachts blasting out music. I think you cannot find a steam yacht, so a proprioceptive pleasure involving the swinging of your body in space without the associated very loud music as my father knows only too well, as he's deaf now, but he grew up with his caravan next to the steam yacht in his fairground. You couldn't have one without the other. As you look through other theme park rides and descriptions of the fairground, it's always that the music is there as part of the total multisensory experience. The proprioceptive, the bodily, may be foregrounded, but it's been modulated and enhanced, ratcheted up by sight, by vision, by mirrors, and by illusion. And then you can probably take it one stage further. Vision is important then to bodily sensation and experience. Sound is important. As Maguire notes, just imagine yourself embarking upon a trip to a theme park to experience some of those proprioceptive or bodily pleasures. As you enter, your senses are assailed by a plethora of stimuli. The rides are whirring, whizzing and clanging. The shrieks coming from the roller coaster complete with a buzz of excited conversation and shouting. Competing with country music loudly, the sun beating down, the other people bumping into you. It's all part of the proprioceptive experience, the total multisensory experience, as they run to join the line for the theme park's most frightening ride. And that can't be dissociated from the taste of the cotton candy, the milkshakes, the hot dogs if you're in the States. It's just this sort of total multisensory experience. It's all contributing to what you enjoy and your sense of pleasure. And some of that, I think, is kind of missed when these rides get taken into the art gallery context. They keep the proprioceptive and bodily elements. They may slow it down, but they eliminate all of the other multisensory cues, I think, that would be typically part of the experience. Now we have, the smell of food and the distinct scent generated by the kinaesthetics of a large crowd generates an olfactory character unique to the theme park. The sweat to go along with the screams of the others. Colours, lights, fellow patrons, and the chimeric architecture give your eyes an unlimited range of things to feast on. In this sensationally sensory experience, you are part of the action. No longer are you watching others experience the fantastical and the phantasmagorical of the silver screen. No longer are you going through the motions of the banality of diurnal life. You are a participant in this fantasy land, and your senses tell you that this is true. And it's all your senses that are doing the work here, contributing to sensory overload, if you will. Finally, beyond the multisensory element of proprioceptive pleasures, kinesthetic thrills, because there's also sort of a historic element to things that are it's very sort of clear, and maybe this isn't unique to proprioception and bodily senses, but that our relationship to, our experience of, and our thoughts around proprioceptive stimulation have changed quite dramatically as the decades have gone by, and hence, if there were to have been proprioceptive art 100 years ago, the audiences would have had, I think, a very different response to it, because our response to proprioception generally was very different back then. And that sort of links into this sort of the rise of what Lynn talked about, sort of the shock of the modern and the rise of steam and electric power, of trains as captured here in Schimmelbusch's The Railway Journey. But if you go back to the first time that people went on a railway journey and felt the speed and the rapid transition of visual images through the window, doctors at the time were just horrified that this would be hugely mentally disturbing. This kind of shock as the carriages rumbled over the lines. This was a whole new kind of sensation for the public. The same thing maybe even from the invention of what's called the vertical railway, or the elevator, again introduced in the US in the 1880s, but a complete failure. People just wouldn't ride on it. This idea, sort of a rapid vertical movement is something, again, that kind of proprioceptive or bodily sensation had not been experienced before, and it was left people uneasy. And even something as mundane as a trip on a moving staircase, or what we today call an escalator. Here, the very first one from Harrods, a department store in London from 1898, was such an experience to behold. The customers would queue up to have a ride on the world's first moving staircase, and those behind us were so worried about the shock of this new kind of proprioceptive experience on the customers that it was smelling salts for the ladies and brandy for the men once you got off this ride to kind of calm your nerves. And that's almost inconceivable today that these simple sort of proprioceptive or bodily experiences would have generated such a strong reaction. And that's sort of, that's sort of the shock of the modern then is partly what Sally Lynn writes about, who says it's probably not coincidental that theme park rides stimulating proprioceptive bodily senses, delivering kinesthetic thrills from the roller coaster and so on, that they came about at the same time as the general public was experiencing the shock of the modern, as railways were coming to transform transportation and deliver a whole new range of bodily sensations. This was sort of alien, frightening to people, and this was where the theme park ride sort of fitted in as an entertaining version, a controlled version of the shock of the modern, and hence allowed people almost to sort of move more smoothly as these new sensations were introduced. That was then 1900 or so that theme park rides become more popular, stimulating the bodily and the other senses. Finally, one might think also about, it's not just in art that appears in the art gallery that proprioception has become more a focus of attention. One sees it also in the world of architecture, with bridges like this one, and this one. There's a whole glut of these sort of horrifying bridges in China, a number of which now have been closed because they're too dangerous. They do sort of foreground your proprioceptive sense through architecture. You feel your body, and maybe we'll have some of the same sensations in an hour or two this afternoon, I don't know. But the idea that foregrounding proprioception of the body in architecture has also become more popular, not just in art. And that probably also links finally to the notion of play, I think. That I guess you can sort of stimulate any of the senses with or without a playful intent. But there seems to be a closer link between proprioception and play than the other senses. And if one takes something like this, put forward by Juhani Palaasma's, the seven sense architecture theorist from Finland, he talks about this sort of fountain in Portland, Oregon, as a sort of proprioceptive architecture, and points to the way that children play, jump around, they interact with this. So it really does engage the bodily senses, but in a playful manner. And that same thing, that sort of playful use of proprioception, is one that I think I also see as slides transition from the fairground to the Tate Modern and the art gallery, but then increasingly into the trendy, hip office workspaces of Shoreditch and elsewhere. And that even now, the Google offices have a list of the best and the worst office slides. And this is all done in sort of a playful manner. I think it's bringing play back to the workplace, doing it through stimulating proprioception, through the fact that your face will be transformed when coming out of this slide, delivering this totally immersive experience that it's hard to take a disinterested stance on. So to conclude then, I'm not sure it's quite conclusion exactly.
It's 45
but this is a work in progress, as we were asked to do. I think I am uneasy, I guess, then about the taking of proprioceptive experiences from the lab and from the fairground, putting them in the art gallery, whether that is enough to call them proprioceptive art. I worry that a lot of the motivation for this comes from this kind of commercialization, trying to get footfall, focusing on the experience, maybe rather than the aesthetic response of audiences. And that, I wonder whether now there's a sense in which we also have kind of a new kind of shock of the modern, something around metaverse and digital extended augmented reality. The technology, once again, is delivering a whole new sensory world, And yet all of all of those augmented and virtual technologies, they do a good job of stimulating our eyes and ears. But what they fundamentally fail to do really is stimulate our bodily senses. And as such, I sort of wonder whether there's a role for the fairground, a ride, the prop art slide, as sort of focusing on this important sensation, but one which cannot be captured by the technology. And with that, I think I shall leave it.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot for your talk. So there's a quarter of an hour left for questions, and let me take the position up here so that I can also follow the chat. And I have to orient myself first where the questions start. Okay, excellent. So, questions in the room first. Isabel. Oh yeah, the microphone. Where's the sponge? Our magic sponge with the microphone. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. It was really interesting, and I gotta say, I feel a lot of it. Like, I agree with a lot of what you said. And I also, I agree with the kind of critical idea of, is this just a trick to get people into the museum? Is this kind of just taking ideas which were already there in fairgrounds, in the labs, and like just using them for something else? But I was wondering whether we could like find a positive spin on it by using a historical analogy, if you want to call it like that. So think of Duchamp's fountain, which I think all of you probably know it. Duchamp took a urinal and put it in an art gallery and called it art. And it is art now. And it is basically something which had a function somewhere else and which we know from somewhere else. And now we experience this differently because we meet it in a different context. And so one of my hopes for proprioceptive artworks, or what we're talking about, the artworks we're talking about here, is that just by being or by interacting with them in a different context, we might experience them differently. And I was wondering, what do you think about that?
Well, I haven't been to any of these proprioceptive artworks nor slid down the slide at Tate Modern when it was there, so I can't give a first-person perspective. But some of those quotes from the North American art critics, would be that at least on your first exposure to Höller's experience with the slides and the flotation tanks and the Pinocchio nose and the upside-down goggles, your audiences are queuing out of the door. Yes, so it's successful, but you're caught in the moment and you can't take that other perspective. You're sort of captured by the bodily sensations and the enjoyment. And I guess their best hope is to say, well, maybe the second time you go back, you might be able to get something more from it. But maybe, So maybe it is that the pleasure in the experience itself that sort of distracts in a way that was not the case for the urinal. It has no intrinsic pleasure or way of engaging you. So maybe you're left only with the question of why is it here and is that right? Whereas maybe the entertainment problem, especially if it's a bodily entertainment, is maybe so strong and so engaging or immersive or overpowering that the other more distance or aesthetic response is much harder to get.
Yeah, Xenia first and then Corinna.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting. I'd like to ask about your perspective as an experimental psychologist. And perhaps you could give us a sense of the methodologies you have within your field, because as I imagine, so in sciences like experimental psychology, controlling an experiment is very important, right? And in case of such experiences like Höllers and others, so it's quite hard, right? To it's important to observe them, right? You can, of course, go through surveys and get to people's subjective self-reflections. But what else is there in terms of the methods that you use?
So I think it's certainly true and a growing awareness that the data and the experiments that the psychologists and neuroscientists do tend to be on what's come to be called weird populations of Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic boys and girls studying psychology. So in North America is 95% of all data points we have about experience. So in that sense, it's growing awareness that it's restricted, limited, and also that the fact of being in a science lab changes the experience. And we have sort of thought sometimes about discussions with various artists about trying to do things in one space or the other. And as I was asking Marcus last night, where is this meeting being held today? Because that's part of setting the context, and we might interact differently if we were in a psychology building or in somewhere else. So I think there's a great awareness of that sort of contextual thing that's been ignored in the past. You can just assume if I control all the variables, then one way to do that may be to do more ecologically valid research. And so I didn't have time to mention it, but one of the challenges is those steam yachts that blast out the music at 100 decibels. I'm not allowed to present sound to you at 100 decibels. It's damaging your hearing. So I cannot recreate the environment in the lab for health and safety reasons. A little bit ironic. But some research just came out from the States, actually took physiological responses and behavioral questionnaires from groups going through a theme park, a haunted house. So they had groups of, then you're actually collecting data in a more, you can collect data sometimes in a sort of valid environment, and that's starting to become slightly more common, obviously hard to do, but... Essentially, and I guess more working obviously in concert halls and such. And one of my favourite ones from there's something about the shared experience, again, which is sort of, and so in the theme park, in this sort of haunted house study with biophysical measures, then they also checked, the relationship between the groups of people in each room. Do you know each other, and how does that modulate your experience of fear and nausea and whatever else? But in the context of in the science lab, it's always there's only just one subject. Normally, you're not in a group. You're isolated. You're sitting still. You don't have any of these other cues of music, the smells. So a bit like the art gallery, it's limited in that sense. And that sort of shared experience element is sort of captured again by this German study where they actually took all the air pre-COVID out of the cinema as people watched thousands and thousands of people watching different kinds of films, and they could pick up sort of this sort of social chemical signal in the outflow of the air, and arguing that's part of the shared experience and why you enjoy seeing things or experiencing in a group. You have this sort of shared chemical signal. And so,
okay. I've got two questions in the chat. First by Benjamin.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. So I wanted to come back to the question of the problem of the privateness of proprioceptive heart that was raised by Marcus. And I wanted to ask what psychology can tell us on this matter. So how can psychology and experimental psychology respond to this problem of privateness?
I suppose in a way, I wasn't sure I entirely agreed. I do have a sense of other people's state of mind, of their internal sensations. And if I can't sense it with my own senses, I guess I can also stick monitors on you and check your blood flow and heart rate and skin conductance. And from that, get a much better sense of check voice patterns. And from that, get a sense of internal state. And I think if you take the case, those people screaming on the roller coaster, I think I know exactly what their internal state is like, but not because I share that proprioceptive experience, but I can infer it from what I hear and what I see, and that maybe those. Don't really want to introduce mirror neurons, but if one is of that persuasion and likes mirror neurons, then maybe you do sort of share the experience, you mirror, in some sense, some part of the experience of others. So maybe it's harder to access another's proprioceptive state. I don't think it's impossible to do so. And if you can't access it necessarily, you can infer or imagine.
Yeah.
You can put yourself in the place of others to a degree.
Right.
So it's like an analogic inference.
Okay.
Probably, unless it's mirror neurons, then it's not an inference. But yeah, I would think so too. Yeah. It's at least not directly perceived. I have another question on the chat, so I'd like to go for this one first, Corinna, and then your question. Lukas is next.
Hello, everyone. Many thanks, Charles, for this talk, and especially for highlighting that proprioception is in the center of the fairgrounds and theme parks and roller coasters, etc. So there's a lot of aesthetic experience already there, and one might ask, also in addition to what Marcus has developed earlier, in which way this aesthetic experience is constitutive for something to be a proprioceptive artwork. You said in the beginning of your talk that proprioception had to be intentionally foregrounded in the viewer's experience for it to be an artwork. And I wonder what this foregroundedness could imply, or how you would spell this out. Now, in the discussion, already in answering an earlier question, there were two options, I think, at play. One was that proprioception in Carsten Höller's work, for instance, is just irrelevant. It's put to the foreground. So clearly, when it's in the Tate Gallery or in the Museum of Modern Art, it's put to the foreground, but it's not necessary, or it's not really what the work as a work of art focuses on. So it is essential. It's essentially there, just like in the fairgrounds, but it's just not about it, you might say. So it's not relevant for its character as an artwork. Or the other option would be that transferring it from, say, the fairground to the art space would, as in the urinals case, infer a different experience. So you experience it differently with a different setting. But the third option would be that this kind of work creates or evokes or foregrounds other proprioceptions than the sensational ones that it works with. You see? So there could be a third option that just by highlighting the sensation one, but also in a way criticizing it already by the different institutional framework, would mean that other proprioceptions are instirred or provoked. Maybe there's a fourth option, but I would like to ask you what kind of proprioception is foregrounded in the artwork if other non-artworks already include aesthetic experiences of proprioception.
So on the one hand, I'd imagine it's to say that proprioceptive or bodily senses are foregrounded is that they are attended, so you're conscious of them in the way that, I guess, we're never conscious of the clothes on our body or the chair we're sitting on until we think about it. And then in that act of thinking about it or attending to our body, suddenly I am aware of the clothes and my contact with the world. So that sort of attention, focusing your attention on this sense, which is normally neglected or is normally in the background, because we're visually dominant. That's one kind of foregrounding. And then you say, well, maybe there's another, that's not enough, or that isn't always all that's going on. By foregrounding it in this context, you're hoping that the audience or the participant will take a kind of almost an external perspective on this sensation that is foregrounded in my attention, my awareness. What is that about? Why? But for that, maybe that might be something you can do if the mirror carousel is going so slowly it's hardly moving at all. But something you can't do for a faster paced ride where maybe you can't have this aesthetic response to it because you can't be disinterested because you're just in the moment and it's so completely immersive that it's impossible to take any other stance than the foreground of your bodily senses in the moment and how you're about to die. In a second sense, that in the mirror carousel, but I suspect not the slide. The bodily sensations might be so toned down and gentle and slow that you can take this disinterested perspective in those bodily sensations, and because of the context, think, why am I experiencing them here, and what do I feel about them here rather than elsewhere? So it's foregrounded in a more contemplative way.
We do have further questions, and we have run out of time already, but since this is the last talk for today, I would like to allow the 3 further questions I have in the chat. I have 2, but Corinna in the audience first, and then Robin and Katrin from the chat.
Okay, yeah, thank you first of all for the interesting presentation in this ride through history with all the fairground attractions. I think my question fits to Isabel's and Xenia's. So I'm also an empirical psychologist. I work in empirical aesthetics, and when you showed the carousel on the fairground and then the carousel in the art gallery, I immediately thought about how to test how aesthetic experience differs between the fairground setting and the gallery setting, because for visual art, as Isabel mentioned, there's a lot of studies on how contexts differ, like how aesthetic experience differs for context. And there's, like, context makes a difference, but for paintings, there's also this smile accommodation, so we can actually oversee that it's a reproduction, and we can also then like see the reproduction on the screen as if it's art. So we can, see over this, and this has been done for visual art, and I think this is maybe not so much possible for proprioceptive art or performance art. Actually, in my lab in Vienna, we are planning a study where we replicate the performance by Marina Abramovich, and the artist is present in the lab, and then also in the gallery context to see whether there's a difference in the experience. Yeah, and I was wondering whether you would think that is interesting, or what you would expect, if you have thought about this yourself as an experimental psychologist.
I suppose I have come out of a few European-ish projects over the last couple of decades with sort of art curators and art historians and aestheticians and scientists on the other side. And it's often cropped up. We've been put in grant proposals to study people's response, particularly to objects in the lab versus in the art gallery, the same objects. If you can get them out of the gallery into the lab on loan, which isn't necessarily so easy. And I do believe that context will have a profound effect. And you're right, you could do exactly the same kind of context manipulation experimentally for some of these slides or carousels in one context or another, and see what happens, and should be done, I suppose.
Question that comes with it would be how to measure this.
And also the fact that you say, okay, I could take groups of people, I can find a suitably small proprioceptive artwork that will fit in the gallery, but also it's congruent in an entertainment space. Take groups into both environments and see how they respond and what they think. But I think you will not be able to capture in the gallery the 100 decibels of music, the smell of the cotton candy, the other sweaty bodies, So how much is that? Is it a place in which it's presented that's doing the work, or that changes the response, or all these other sensations that maybe you can't easily reproduce in an art space?
Yeah, you have to probably start somewhere and reduce the experience to some aspects of it. Okay, thank you.
Right, good. We have two questions, as I said, from the chat. Robin first, please.
Thanks very much for the presentation. And thanks also to Lukas for posing a question I found really thought-provoking with regards to this collection of material, particularly because I think one of the things that Carsten Höller's work does is highlight a particular cultural phenomenon. In other words, like certain popular forms of entertainment. And I wonder if the presentation of these forms in the gallery is not actually not inviting participation, but observation and ridicule in a way. In other words, it's, as Lukas was suggesting, a commentary, and as such is a lot more semiotic than it is really proprioceptic. And I wonder if there aren't better examples, ones that aren't making explicit reference to the fun fair and to the traditions of the fun fair, others that ask you to participate with your body, and there's absolutely no other way to participate. This is exactly what Lukas was saying, really. But I'm thinking about, light art, a whole range of other arts of the 20th century that actually demand corporeal involvement and aren't possible to partake of in any other fashion, but don't allow you to separate yourself from the idiots who are, involved. In other words, I feel like the slides and the roundabout invite you to step back and separate yourself from corporeal involvement in a way that other objects can't permit. In other words, once you are observing them, you are involved. There's no way of avoiding them. That would be my question.
So I wonder whether there are, might say, theme park and fairground inspired rides in that context are a special case of proprioceptive stuff, and there are others that don't have reference other aspects of culture or don't have another environment in which you've come across them before, and they may be importantly different, and yet I guess from that Lindblad piece, I think of Höller saying, of course, those who are sliding down the slide, those who are on the merry-go-round, they are experiencing directly proprioception. But the slides are transparent so that the audience waiting in the queue or just passing through the turbine hall are also part, or so they're not able in a way to detach from it. It's in some sense.
But if the search was for some more pure proprioceptive art, then we could look at choreographies. That might be dance or yoga or martial art choreographies. If they are centered in an art context, then you cannot possibly perceive the artwork or engage with the artwork unless you have these proprioceptions. They're really at center stage. While the installations, you can always ignore them or ignore the proprioception and only visually look at them, etc. But for a realization of a choreography, be that dance or yoga, etc., you must engage your body, and then you would have a purer proprioception in these cases. If that was the one target of the question, whether we could have that kind, and yeah.
Although presumably there are a few rare individuals without proprioception.
Of course, yeah, but again, it's
choreography.
But it's always the question whether that's accidental. Of course, as embodied creatures, we always proprioceive. We can't help it. But is it an essential part of the artwork or not? That would be important. I do have further questions here. I can only take one further one by Katrin, please, in the chat. And then Peter has a long comment. Thanks, Peter, for that. I can't focus on that. I'm afraid, because we are running out of time and have to go to the museum, at least those of us who are in the room here. But Katrin, your question, please.
Hi, thank you very much for the talks. It's very, very interesting. I apologize if my question maybe is something all the other more knowledgeable listeners already know, but I have some trouble with the term of disinterest, because I feel if we are talking about intentions of the artist and the viewer, the disinterested part poses a problem for me, because as soon as I am willing to engage in especially proprioceptive art, I feel that part is taken away, but maybe it's a complete misunderstanding of the term on my part. I apologize again if I'm not as knowledgeable in this.
So I maybe take it rightly or wrongly to apply that you can make some evaluation without a bodily consequence, or in the absence of desire or feeling an abstract judgment about something as it is, not because of how it affects you. Or so of the Mona Lisa, I can say it's beautiful or not without any reference to particular feeling or desire. It's a rate in itself, whereas the other cases like food, the argument, or the ride would be, I cannot kind of concentrate on the thing without my judgment's always going to be coloured by my experience or my desire for, in one case, the food on the plate, or on the case of the ride, I cannot switch off that total immersion.
So thanks for maybe I can offer a thought here. Thanks for this question. I thought about this when you mentioned the disinterested part of aesthetics, and I mean it comes from, or it can be seen in romantic paintings. Consider some Caspar David Friedrich, the iceberg, or whatever it's called. When we look at it, we can be disinterested and still have this feeling of awe. Disinterested because in the sense of we are in no danger. We see the danger of the ice, of the isolation, of the coldness, of the sharp edges of the ice, but we are in no danger. And this is why we can be disinterested or step back. We are not affected in a physical sense. And that is not possible for proprioceptive art. However, this quote you had where the person said, and I felt I was going to die, or I surely go, that's not the case, actually. I mean, that was an exaggeration by the writer, and I see where this exaggeration is coming from. But we are going on these rides being sure that nothing is going to happen to us. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it, or many of us wouldn't do it. So even the fairground rides are disinterested in the sense of we sure know, or at least we assume, that we are not going to die, that this machine is working, it's safe. And so I think the disinterested part can also be in proprioception as well, because it's a safe environment and not really free climbing or some other kind of activity which really puts you in danger or your life in danger. So it's possible to have disinterested proprioceptions.
I agree with the sentiment that it feels like you're going to die.
I know it feels like, but you're sure you're not. Otherwise, you wouldn't take the ride. Most of us wouldn't take the ride.
But that whether it's the knowing or the feeling, that's key in that case.
But that's the same with the ice. What's the painting called by Friedrich? Eismeer in German. I don't know the German, the English word, but that's the feeling there. I mean, I see the danger, I see the coldness, I see the sharp edges, etc. But I know I'm safe. I go on the roller coaster, it feels like I'm going to die, but I know I won't. So I think there's a perfect parallel here.
I feel cold looking at the iceberg.
Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, I know. I see what you mean. Yeah, it is somehow closer. It is closer. As with food, if we are hungry, can you really have a disinterested meal? That's.
I think so, maybe the analogy with the rubber hand illusion, where again you have these questions. I know that rubber hand on the table is not my own hand,
but still,
but it feels like me, and I will. If I then stab the rubber hand, you will sweat.
Yeah, of course. Take.
So I know it's not, but that sort of sense of feeling or embodiment feels different from just watching a hand being stabbed on a movie or something, or in a painting.
Right. Good. We must go and proprioceptive now at the museum, so we ought to stop here now. Charles, thanks again for your great talk.